Hello, welcome to another Paro seminar. I give these every month. Used to be kind of behind Patreon, but now I'm doing them on YouTube. You're my second interview guest. The plan, as many of you know, is for me to have more conversations with people. I'll still do the kind of straight to camera talks occasionally, but also want to have interesting conversations. And Cadell flew over for a week online event we were doing last night, and so we're going to talk a little together. Cadell is someone who I have a deep affinity with in terms of your intellectual journey, love. I've known his work for a few years now, really since you started YouTube. How many years ago was that? 2?
Yeah, well, I started the Less Than Nothing series like 2018, 2017.
Oh. Wow, okay, so I remember
It
goes back a bit. And Cadell has been doing kind of really deep dives into some very serious texts, bring people on these courses, they create anthologies together. You can find out more on Philosophy Portal. But the conversation today, which I'm very excited about, is one that whenever you ever hear speakers say, a lot of people have asked me, usually that means no one's asked them, right? A lot of people have asked me to do a course on, no one's asked you, you just want to do it. But this is an exception. A lot of people have asked me, or at least discussed psychedelics and what my thoughts are on that and how it fits, if at all, with kind of the work of parotheology. And I've been, reluctant to have those conversations because it's not an area of expertise. And I wanted to have these conversations with someone whose intellectual work, I really respect. Someone who is reading the same kind of thinkers that we have been wrestling with, and begin a conversation. And I imagine this will become a series of conversations, maybe some with you, Cadell, and also with other people. But this is really an introduction to a larger conversation that I think will happen this year and in coming years. Again, just a little bit of kind of background to this, and you can fill in some of the details, but it's the whole psychedelic thing in the 60s in America and in the UK. There was a lot of research being done by government and by therapists into the effects, and there was a lot of interest. And then that all closed down. And in recent years, it seems like there's been a renewed interest again. So we're kind of coming back to where maybe we were a little bit in the 60s and 70s before the war on drugs. And people use psychedelics, I was thinking about to say, like for one of 4 reasons generally. There's recreational use of psychedelics, there's therapeutic use, there is the mystical experience, and there is metaphysical inquiry. I've got a feeling we're going to talk more about the latter 2 than the former 2, but we may bounce around. But just in terms of that history, am I kind of right on that there was a lot of interesting work being done in like the 60s?
Yeah, no, I think that is the standard or the classical narrative is that there was a huge impact of psychedelics in what's called the countercultural movement, which of course has many socio-political overtones related to civil rights, related to what's now LGBTQ rights, what's related to even deepening movements of waves of feminism, waves of secularization. But it's interesting that psychedelics holds this type of mystical dimension within those socio-political movements. And then, probably the figure for anyone who's interested in following that line of thought would probably be best to research Timothy Leary's work. Timothy Leary became kind of the figure, and in part because he was a psychologist, in part because he was doing research at Harvard, and in part because there was a big transgressive battle between Timothy Leary and the establishment or the academic. What where the line is on that, and of course the line became a hard no.
Yeah.
In the end, and then we basically have.
Did he lose his job?
He lost his job. Yeah. As well, there's some others. Like another big one was actually connected to Timothy Leary was the man who became Ram Dass.
Oh yes.
We know Ram Dass. He was also a part of this.
Oh yeah.
So there are many figures. Those are some of the big ones. Alan Watts also comes to mind. However, if you actually look at like Google Scholar, you look at the history of publications, basically it shuts down completely. Yeah. There's nothing. Yeah. So like there's nothing in the 70s, there's nothing in the 80s, there's trickles in the 90s, and now it's really back in a big way.
Do you know, is there a particular reason for that, or set of reasons? Is it?
I think it was kind of an underground mesh network, like almost like and I've been a part of these underground networks. So like when I was a part of these networks, they kind of function like almost like Deleuzian rhizomes, like a rhizomatic network of cultural agents, activists who are playing around in establishing rituals, building ceremonies, starting little businesses, related to not so much the recreational use of psychedelics happens, but these rhizomatic networks are much more shamanic. Yeah. They're ceremonial. They are aimed at healing. They're primarily aimed at the therapeutic and the mystical. Yeah. These networks.
So could you, when I mentioned those four, could you break those down briefly? And if you think I missed anything,
those four are a good, categorization for this conversation. Okay. I think. Yeah. Most people in the West, myself included, whether they think about it or not, actually have their start with psychedelics in some sort of one-off recreational context where they actually don't think much about it, like that it happened. Like usually when I talk to people about it, like, oh yeah, like back when I was 18, I did mushrooms with some friends and it kind of was cool, and then I forgot about it.
Yes.
Something like that.
That was pretty much when I was younger. The only knowledge I had was recreational, because in Ireland, it just wasn't much of the culture. So yeah, recreational use, for some people, that was the only kind of experience I had. I didn't actually do anything at that stage, but a few of my friends would do mushrooms when they were teenagers, that kind of thing.
Exactly, and that was my retroactively thinking about the narrative of my relationship with psychedelics. That was my beginning too, but it was. I think I did it once or twice as a teenager. I did mushrooms, but I didn't think much of it in it was kind of a trippy experience, but I didn't think about it in a philosophical sense. I didn't think about it in a this is blowing my worldview apart or something like that. It was only anyway. So most people have that recreational context, but so the where it is almost forcing itself, reintroducing itself into academic, intellectual, philosophical conversations is these rhizomatic networks helping people in primarily therapeutic or, like I said, mystical context. So the therapeutic context can be basically processing of emotional trauma, getting in touch with certain sensitivities which are perhaps unconscious or perhaps you are numb to. And the psychedelics might open you up to different dimensions of affect, might open you up to different dimensions of your unconscious that you were struggling with or previously just unaware of. And then the mystical dimension of things is basically people who feel a type of lack, a type of emptiness, a type of limit of, let's say, broadly speaking, scientific materialism, secular modernity. That, we're in scientific materialism, we're in secular modernity, but I don't really go to church, I don't really have a religious affiliation, I don't really believe in God, maybe I'm agnostic, maybe I don't really know, maybe I'm searching, but I feel like there's something missing. And oftentimes for many people, psychedelics reintroduce a dimension of reality which might be called mystical, might be called a reconnection with the ineffable, reconnection with the supersensible. Opening up dimensions of reality which you have an experiential contact with, but you previously didn't know existed,
Yes.
quote unquote.
And this is a type of immediate experience. It's not like to kind of gain knowledge or anything, but it's kind of like to undergo a type of, yes, connection.
Yeah, so it's not like, and that's the thing. So like with scientific modernity and secular modernity, scientific materialism, we are usually thinking in terms of positive content, positive knowledge, like my knowledge of the laws of physics. When I was in university, it was my knowledge of evolutionary mechanisms and my capacity to think with those mechanisms and to conduct research with those mechanisms. But oftentimes when we're trained in science, or even, when we're trained in the social sciences or the humanities, those forms of knowledge and methods don't necessarily have a connection to my life in a holistic sense.
Yeah.
So people usually feel a whole.
Yeah.
They feel a whole, HOLE, where there perhaps is a desire for the whole.
Yeah.
In the bigger sense. And so psychedelics often play some sort of role of mediation, of not like the mistake with psychedelics would be, and this is a big problem with psychedelics, is like, you have a mystical experience and you feel like I'm the Buddha, or you feel like I'm Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Because of some sort of cultural relationship or some book you've read about spirituality. And then you feel like I'm at the divine Godhead of all reality, and that can also lead to ego inflation. So like you then identify, you go from being, let's say, Joe Blow on the street to being in touch with the Godhead, and then there's a big gap that opens up, and there's really no space to hold in that gap, and so you have a lot of you could say psychedelic blowout, but in the positive sense, it's basically connecting you with something that feels like home in the experience.
So that's the mystical, and then the metaphysical. How would you describe
So I would so let's, like, what is metaphysics, right? Like, this is a big question. Like, even like, for example, in the history of philosophy, you have someone like Heidegger writing Being and Time, and then the next thing he's writing is, what is metaphysics?
Yeah. Yes.
Right. So right. So it's like, what is metaphysics? And like, metaphysics comes to us from Aristotle, and he wrote his metaphysics, and in the ancient world, metaphysics was very closely linked to physics, in the sense that in the same way at the beginning of scientific modernity, science and philosophy were not yet really differentiated. Like Newton's Principia was basically titled under a natural philosophy. Metaphysics is basically the conceptual distinctions. It's the logical structures that we use to interpret phenomena.
Yeah. So in this context, whenever I say metaphysics, it's kind of like where somebody might take psychedelics in order to, they think whether it's real or not, gaining some knowledge as to the relationship between mind and matter, or the nature of ultimate reality. So the mystical is kind of like, you're having an experience, but for some it's a metaphysical journey, and it's kind of, in the terms of philosophy, ontological. It's somehow giving an insight into the very fundamental dimensions of being. Yeah.
Right. So like let's say there's a certain, let's start it like this. So like there's a certain democratic aspect to mysticism, which I think I'm kind of following Terence McKenna in saying that, is that like the democratic aspect of mysticism is like, you take X dose, I take X dose, we both have access to the mystical, ineffable in itself. Metaphysics is then, how do we conceptually sense make that experience?
Yeah.
And in regards to conceptually sense making that experience, there's something that is much more conflictual. There's something where we can have different interpretations.
Yes.
There can be there can be basically, I would say, socio-political, socio-cultural consequences. So like, this is where, like, quickly I would bring it back to this idea from the counterculture, and bringing it back for our moment is, okay, so the counterculture had some relationship to the psychedelic experience, but the counterculture was also primarily constituted by socio-cultural, socio-political processes, and that is actually metaphysics.
Yes.
When we talk, so when we talk about the third wave of feminism, when we talk about civil rights. These are actually, if we really take the word metaphysics seriously, these are metaphysical battles.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I have been skeptical of the psychedelic movement as such, or movements, in that a lot of the people who I've read or who I know who are in that world have a very particular type of metaphysics. It's almost like, I mean, my skepticism, so when I moved to LA, just as a background, it was funny, I felt like an anthropologist kind of going into a world where, this kind of psychedelic thing was massive. And so it was kind of interesting for me to encounter that. But the kind of the intellectual dimension around psychedelics was this perennial philosophy, this kind of non-dual, of like wholeness, completeness thing. And it was often not very thought through, not very philosophically rigorous.
No.
It was quite off-putting. And it's funny, so people like yourself,
I'm antagonistic with this as well.
Yeah.
So I found myself attracted to the psychedelic experience. I was even attracted to, in some sense, the psychedelic ethos and sensibilities in many ways, but I was always turned off by the psychedelic metaphysics, and I found it unreflective, and I thought actually that it was obfuscating was antagonism and conflict.
Yes,
that
exactly.
When you can just, and that often happens, the funniest thing would be like at a transpersonal non-dual conference, having like the different speakers on the stage presenting their non-dual picture of the world and getting into fights with each other.
Yeah.
But like very unreflectively, not realizing that what was going on was actually a crack in their metaphysical picture of reality. Because if the ultimate reality was this non-dual one without division, like the technical definition of non-dual, so this is where metaphysics immediately comes into like philosophical intellectual conflict. So like, what does non-dualism mean? Well, non-dualism means one without division.
Yes.
So if we were really living in a world without division, from a psychoanalytic point of view, we wouldn't be speaking.
Yes.
We wouldn't even be individuated entities.
Yes.
It's kind of it's got the shoe it's kind of got the cart. Non-dualism as it's traditionally presented, and there are different versions of non-dualism. So, but in the most common pop sense of non-dualism, you get this sense that they're putting the cart before the horse, because it's like we are individuated entities in the world, and then they think they can go back to some oneness state where there was like no cut, no division.
And even if you cut the world into there is just one, and then there is the illusion of difference, that's still dual. Like that's it. So so as a philosophical,
there's all
system,
these funny things.
It felt, and that always, it was actually one of my friends who was encouraged me. He said, "But just Pete, remember, it wasn't just all of these kind of Jesus freaks, because it was a lot of the Jesus freaks who were the kind of 1970s Christians. They were all acid heads who then got into Jesus. And then what I've noticed is there's a lot of people who were into Jesus who are now getting into acid. So there's this interesting...
This is a dialectics.
Yeah, dialectics. And there's a sense, a friend of mine wrote a book called Getting High. And it was about how we're always trying to get high, whether space, technology, getting space, get this desire to get high. And it's like, but then my friend said, well, just remember, punks also did drugs, and like they're not into all of that stuff. And I was like, okay, that's good. There's
punks.
There's a punk scene in the kind of the psychedelic world, but they do not have much airplay. That kind of more antagonistic kind of thing.
I also see like a lot of punk culture is associated with like straight edge.
Oh yeah.
Like there's also punk scenes that are straight edge, clean.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. I mean, was it Henry Rollins was pretty straight edge in his day? Yeah. Because so people like yourself and Richard Boothby, who has done supervised psychedelic experience as part of a therapeutic model, and I'm going like, you and him are both people who deeply value and understand this idea of the divided subject, and the idea that kind of in a sense this wholeness is a type of fantasy that can be different. So I would say to you at first is like, well, how do you square that circle? Is there a psychedelic experience for you that is not about, and I'm going to put words in your mouth because you said this to me earlier, that not about addition, some experience of some substantive divine, but a type of subtraction, a type of loss?
Yeah, so I mean, how I square this circle with the whole and the divided subject is basically, and this, you know, this is something that I couldn't have actually articulated in a philosophical sense unless I can't just get this knowledge through the psychedelic experience. It required that I do put in the philosophical work to be able to sense make and to be able to talk to you about this in a linguistic context. Is I actually think that what is going on with a psychedelic experience is that you reconcile yourself with the cut, or you reconcile yourself with the division as positive. So the way I think about this is like, and the way I've experienced this is, it's almost like it can take you back to that feeling of being born. It can take you back to that feeling of being in the womb, where you are the cut. Like, it's like reality is whole in the womb, but then there's this cut, and you exist on the condition of the cut, which is you being born, and you are in the cut. Yes. And that's precisely it. Your identity, your becoming, your self-notion exist on the condition that there's a cut. And I think the unreflective move is to desire the oneness before the cut. But the self-reflective move is to actually see the cut as positive, as a condition for your becoming. Yes. So that's sort of how I think about it.
So this is, it's almost like, because if psychedelics has been kind of very connected to perennial philosophy and the philosophy of the whole, WHOLE, then you're saying that it's possible to take psychedelics as an experience of the whole, HOLE. So these are the two kind of competing philosophies, and that interests me, and I am drawn to this idea that if there's a connection between psychedelics and kind of the work of psychoanalysis and paratheology, it's going to be in this, not you take this substance to kind of like gain some sort of mystical, substantive oneness, non-dual, monist kind of experience, but somehow it brings you into an acceptance, an affirmation, and even a joy of our division of the cut.
And the unity of identity and difference. Basically. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is that, like, because there is a cut, there's identity linked to difference. There's identity linked to otherness. And what the most unreflective sort of forms of consciousness are always looking for is a way for their identity to reduce otherness to a symmetrical image of itself. And this is like basically a mirror image, right? And so like in Lacan's work, it's the mirror stage. Right, where you're looking for a symmetrical other. And this is basically a function, you know, if you go into the psychoanalysis, and to me this makes complete logical sense, is that if you go into the psychoanalysis, this comes into basically your ego or your self has its origin in an impotent body. Like if you think about what it's like to be a baby, just think about what it's like to be a baby. Like I was talking to some friends recently about, like, how long does it take before you know how to shit? Right? How long does it take before you know how to walk? Right? Like, and you think, well, like, I can walk. I mean, I take it for granted. I can control when I shit. I take it for granted.
But you learn that when a horse is born, it's walking within seconds.
With humans, it's a fucking disaster.
Yes,
it's a disaster because we're such a paradox. The human, and I think, like, for example, the theologian, we might even call him a pyrotheologist, G.K. Chesterton would say something like, you know, we are this ultimate paradox of like of an impotent animal and like a superhuman consciousness. Like we hold these both dimensions in us.
Yes. And Pascal's very good on that as well.
Yeah, many thinkers are really good on that, but you know, it's just, you know, why do our identities want to collapse the otherness? It's because we feel impotent. You know, and this is like takes us to Lacan's notion of like symbolic castration and stuff like that. This feeling of impotence, this feeling of, and that has socio-political, socio-cultural implications. Like, I feel like, you know, who doesn't feel impotent politically? Who doesn't feel impotent economically? Who doesn't feel impotent sexually? Right? Like, all of us have some struggles in like what I think could broadly be called libidinal economy or libidinal politics. some confrontation with impotence, or like as you always emphasize, some confrontation with lack, and that's why it's so important when you emphasize the communal dimension in pyrotheology of a community of lack, a community of contradiction. That basically is a community of people who have accepted the cut, have accepted the impotence, and are willing to face it and work with it, which basically means that their identities are capable of moving and relating to otherness in a different way.
Yeah. Let me do not a quick fire round, but let's tell you all of my skepticisms or concerns. And one of them connects with this idea of political impotence, that we feel impotent. And I've got a feeling you're going to be empathise with some of these. So we'll see. So first of all, I'll say that, yes, my experience with psychedelics and people who I know are on that is that it can and does sometimes give them this experience of deep insight, deep power, hearing messages from God, etc., etc. It kind of connected with that, a depoliticization in many ways. So they kind of look and I had one friend who said that, in the aftermath of psychedelic experience, they looked at this homeless person and they realized that they were one with this person. But there was kind of an apolitical dimension to this, and in my experience in LA, the people who are in it doesn't feel like there's a materialist kind of like connection with the world, like asking questions about economic conditions and all of this. It feels like you can have this experience sometimes of profound oneness with God, messages from the divine, power and connection, but just seems to lack teeth.
I totally agree. So for example, whether or not the thing is that people are always looking for the one solution to all the problems. Right, and that takes us back to this problem of identity being fundamentally linked to otherness and trying to reduce. So you say, oh well, I've heard the message from God now, or I've had the mystical experience, or now I've had some contact with Jesus. So now I don't need to think about economics. I don't need to think about politics. I don't need to think about sexuality. Right? That's very convenient, but actually that is a form of like almost psychotic disillusionment and even psychotic detachment.
Yes.
Right. It's about understanding, so it's like psychedelics are very challenging and the mystical is very challenging because it's difficult to categorize. And so the problem is we can't let that experience. I think there is a place in our societies for that experience in the same sense that when I grew up as a kid, there was a place on every corner for a liquor store, or for cigarettes. Yeah, so I think that there should be a space in our. I think that there's potentially a way to upgrade our society's relationship to substance, to getting high. There are all ways of getting high are not equal. And I do think that entheogens, as I think they're best called, or psychedelics do have a positive role in our society if they're contained right, but they are not a panacea. They do not solve your economic problems. They do not solve the problems you might have with your boss. They do not solve whatever your company's revenue. They do not help you interact with the opposite sex. They do not help you. Not necessarily. Right. Yeah. So we have to understand their role, their place, and their limit. And that brings us to the crucial problem with a lot of psychedelic philosophy, is that it doesn't know its own limit.
Yeah. Because Deleuze talks about in Guattari, they talk about it's a materialist psychology, but saying that almost like if you want, and this is more therapeutic than anything, but if you want to kind of like experience healing of some sort, it's kind of you have to take into consideration our economic environment, our political environment, the alienation, and so to what extent is this return to psychedelics and this increase in psychedelics like a solution to the problem of alienation in contemporary society? But it's a solution almost like drinking. It kind of can numb you a little bit to to the profound sense of alienation within our political and economic system, but without giving us the teeth to try to kind of change that system. Is there?
I think. Yeah. No, I think that's a fantastic question, and it just actually reminds me of something that came up in Alenka Zupancic's "What Is Sex," of the difference between Badiou and Lacan in regards to wandering, excess, and the -1. So just like, I know, not to get too technical with that, but like you could view the explosion of interest in psychedelics as a symptom, as opposed to a solution.
Yes.
As that, what is that symptom pointing towards? And I think that that's the role of philosophy, where we have to say that your psychedelic experience is not a solution to, again, the sexual, the political, the economic dimensions of your life, but it can potentially give you a new perspective to confront those issues.
And that's because you mentioned, so there's a crisis today in terms of, say, sexuality, and more people are, opting out of dating, opting out of relationships, are having purely contractual sexual relationships like OnlyFans, that kind of thing, avoiding the toxicity of the other, all of these kind of things that we're seeing today, increasing celibacy, et cetera, et cetera. And so the worry is, again, psychedelics can provide a kind of painkiller, a way to kind of like avoid a lot of legitimate problems in terms of sexual difference, in terms of alienation in society. But to what extent can it be used to address those, and to what extent are they used by people to kind of like, I guess, cover over or numb the pain?
Right. Like, the thing is like, I think the way, the place, the first, I would say there has to be a limit of psychedelics. Like, it's not, you can't be using it to solve all problems. That's the wrong approach. But the positive thing about psychedelics is that it's not a numbing agent.
Okay, yeah.
Psychedelics are, that I would differentiate psychedelics from alcohol or something like or I don't know, other harder drugs, in the sense that they actually, if you're in the right set and setting, which became sort of a catchphrase. I mean, you can use it, if you use psychedelics in recreational party context, you might just be using it to bypass, right? But if you're using it in a
set and setting, just for people, like, set is your mindset, and setting is the environment. So
exactly.
You go in with they dub it a good mindset, a positive mindset.
If you're doing mushrooms at a party versus you're doing mushrooms in a contained psychotherapeutic environment, this is like the difference of set and setting.
Yeah.
Or you could do psychedelics in a religious ceremonial context, which would be another example of a set and setting.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Right, or something like that. So, but the point being is that if you're using psychedelics in the right set and setting, what's going to happen is that you are going to be confronted with the whole of yourself. Mm-hmm. Like you're going to be confronted with all the emotions. Mm-hmm. So ideally, what we really need are processes after those experiences to help people sense make what those emotions mean for the real of their life.
Yeah.
And the real of their life is not the harmonious one. The real of their life is that problem with your partner. Yes. Or the real of your life is that I don't really know what to do with my life. Or that real of your life might be, how do I combine my interest in art with paying the rent next month?
Yes. And this is where Richard Boothby is interesting. So, he tragically lost his son to suicide. And he wrote a beautiful memoir about it, came out last year. You know the story, you've talked to Boothby. And he, in a controlled environment with therapists, used small amounts of psilocybin precisely as a way to be able to not avoid a confrontation with the suffering and the pain, but precisely to provide a context where that could be looked at and tarried with and wrestled with. And that was refreshing to me, because again, my small experience with people in that world is it's not so much used to kind of enter into the fray and the difficulty, but often has been used as a way out. But as you're saying, it's like fire. Fire can burn or it can heat, and the way that the set and setting is important. Now, this does bring me to my next skepticism or question, And it's the idea that I'm skeptical, but I've got question marks, that you can access the unconscious through meditation or drugs or any kind of higher consciousness stuff. So the Lacanian idea that, and we're coming from Freud, that the unconscious is in a way encountered through the Freudian slip, through the power praxis, through language itself. But there is some extent to which you would say that you think you can encounter the unconscious.
Probably not in the way that most psychedelic philosophers might think. So when we think about, for example, the way in which we're thinking about the unconscious in a Freudian sense, like you already mentioned, we've got what? We've got dreams, we've got slips of the tongue, and we've got jokes.
Yes.
Now, another thing that we would add to that is a shattering love encounter. The shattering love encounter would be basically another place where the subject emerges in a discontinuity and a rupture of itself. And I would say that when people identify their unconscious with the images that they see in a psychedelic trip, that would be the false notion of encountering the unconscious. This would be maybe more of a Jungian interpretation. But I think the way in which psychedelics could be interpreted and being encountered in psychedelics in a Freudian sense would be in their shattering nature. So in a full-blown psychedelic trip, you are shattered, and you are ripped apart. And it's not so much the images, the excess that you experience in your psychedelic trip. It's more that there's a radical rupture. There's a radical discontinuity in the before and after of that experience, and it's basically reconciling yourself with that rupture, that cut.
Because, the unconscious is obviously a very difficult subject to get your head around. My current way of thinking about the unconscious is that the unconscious, because there's a difficulty, because in one sense the unconscious is a dimension or a crack. It is the void. It's not something that you can access, so it's unconscious, and yet in another sense, the unconscious is what you encounter through slips of the tongue, through power praxis. So the way I would boil it down is to say, the unconscious is this split in our subjectivity, and how that split manifests itself in our desire and in our language. So it's kind of both. It's the unconscious is simply the name for a rupture, but it's also how that rupture is sedimented in our historical contingent lives. Now, I'm saying that because I think something like 5-MeO-DMT potentially helps you encounter the unconscious purely as the nothing.
Yeah, I think 5-MeO-DMT is probably the cleanest cut in the psychedelic universe. It's also the most powerful. It's typically not necessarily associated with hallucinogenic images. It's much more connected with a dramatic rupture.
So you kind of like, there is no you inside, outside, me, you. There's a kind of an absolute blurring of all of that. And so I kind of wonder if you go like, well, yeah, that's kind of an encounter with this primal repression, or this kind of, it's an encounter with a fundamentally disruptive experience. Yeah,
it is a fundamentally disruptive experience. Yeah.
So, and the reason why I'm thinking out loud, this is fun to talk to you, is that this is why potentially it's not something that can take the place of analysis.
No.
And precisely because analysis looks at the unconscious as it sediments.
I have a story about that.
Oh yeah, brilliant.
So I have a story about that. So when I was doing research on the history of psychedelic philosophy, I came across the work of Stanislav Grof. And Stanislav Grof is in some sense, the guy in many philosophical psychedelic circles. And his story, I like to reverse his story basically, because he was first influenced by Freud and Jung, and was working with psychoanalysis. But then when he encountered psychedelics, he thought he found something deeper or beyond psychoanalysis, so that we could use psychedelics in a psychotherapeutic context in a way to get around free association. And I see this actually as a regression.
Yes.
Because if we, as we both know, like if you go back to the origin of psychoanalysis, it started with actually methods of hypnosis. And so when I say that Groff thinking that psychedelics takes us deeper than psychoanalysis, actually I think it's taking us back to pre-psychoanalysis. It's taking us back to the methods that were more dealing with hypnosis.
Yeah.
And and being suggestive of the unconscious. And I think that this is where we actually see shamanistic like figures who can potentially, get themselves involved in very questionable ethical behaviors and in regards to suggesting even sexual or political dimensions where there's unethical, where basically you're opening the unconscious in a way to bring people to their most vulnerable and playing around in that vulnerability, which is the opposite of what you want to do as a psychoanalyst. So for me, it's kind of the opposite way, is like, whether it's hypnosis, whether it's psychedelics, whether it's some sort of other, pre-modern, pre-psychoanalytic technique to open your mind, you can't get around speech. And you can't get around the speech of the unconscious, and you can't get around the sedimentation of that speech throughout your personal history with intimate familial dynamics. Oedipal or non-Oedipal, I don't care. Intimate partner relationships when you were going through puberty. Your intimate relationship to political economic context, which may or may not be reflecting earlier parental dynamics.
Yes.
All of that is your responsibility. So it's not, and this is the Lacanian point, it's not just because we have an unconscious that I can, blame it on the unconscious. You're responsible for your unconscious. And so psychedelics aren't a way to get around this either. So, what I'm saying is that, and I want to be clear here, is like, I mean, I'm basically a psychoanalytic philosopher. And so for me, if you're looking for the way, of course there's no the way, but you can't get around free association, methods of free association. And you can't get around the labor that goes into developing your own metaphysical understanding.
Yeah. Also, in terms of psychoanalytic practice, the main way of encountering the unconscious is through another, the analyst who is a mute, silent. You're not even seeing them. If you're lying on a couch, you're looking at the ceiling. So there is this empty presence there that you then project onto, and then you engage in transference, and they become the figures, these intimate figures from your past. And there is a sense in which, obviously within the psychedelic experience, it can be quite a kind of enclosed fortress experience. It can be quite autistic in the technical sense of that term, of being kind of like disconnected. Now, which is very positive in a way. So we make, somebody wants to meditate, be on their own, but you can't replace the idea that I encounter those intimate relationships and what's going on in me precisely by, if you're my analyst, putting them onto you, and you as the analyst experiencing and feeling that transference and kind of reflecting on and feeding back to me the transference that I'm doing. So there's a certain sense in which, like, there's something important and really good that can be done through private meditation and private reflection. But what interests me about analysis,
that doesn't involve the other.
Yes, it doesn't involve the other.
Yeah, that's right. I think if you're, so it's interesting. In my experience at Buddhistic retreats or Buddhistic sanctuaries, oftentimes I would of course to some degree take seriously the practices of meditation that they were teaching and so forth, but I was really interested in talking to them about why they found themselves at a Buddhistic monastery, and oftentimes it was due to heartbreak. So here's the thing: is what is heartbreak? So I was bringing up like that shattering love encounters can also bring you to the contents of the unconscious, right? And in a shattering love encounter, what you're dealing with is the zero level of the problem of the other in regards to your identity and the difference with your identity.
Yeah.
And it's bringing you to all those intimate materials of your first encounter with the other, the mother.
Yes.
Right, or the intimate relations of your early life, and that feeling of impotence, right? So Buddhism is a way, in some sense, to cultivate a relationship to like an otherness within, which is like it's almost like trying to de-other the other. In some sense, it's a way to de-other the other, and is one way to maybe think about it, but ultimately, when we're coming to psychoanalytic solutions to this problem, we have to develop a different disposition to to confront the radically other as extant, as which is almost like the internal overlap between the internal and the external, and my fantasies with the other. So it's not just that we can call, like, say, samsara an illusion. It's in some sense, samsara is an illusion, like a real illusion. And so there's a really fruitful. I've always thought there's a really interesting philosophical location is to think the difference between Buddhism and psychoanalysis on the question of motion, on the question of drive, on the question of the unconscious.
Right, in the conscious, absolutely. Yeah, and on this notion of the other then, so something like MDMA strikes me as bringing you new experience where, of course, you feel this empathy with the other, you feel this one, but there's a little part of me that's like, it feels like it's the mirror stage, it feels like you're kind of like all the difference between you and the other, all of that is kind of like you're seeing the other as an extension of yourself. It feels like it's actually ironically a disconnect from the other, even though you can
might
feel
be
this,
narcissistic.
Yes, it's a narcissistic kind of like love, basically.
Yeah. So I mean, at the end of the day, so like, and this is the thing, is like there is no solution with a capital S to the other than your capacity. Like, so let me give the example of me and my personal history, my personal life is when I was in my early 20s. I had fantasies of monogamy, fantasies of the one, where basically what I didn't realize is that those fantasies of the one, those fantasies of monogamy, were an attempt to reduce the other to the one. Now, in some sense, now today I'm still sort of committed to the ethics of monogamy, but it's almost like a monogamy of the other. Where really what you're trying to do is cultivate a certain stance within yourself, or cultivate a certain disposition within yourself, where of course you can't handle all the otherness. Like, you can't handle all otherness. That's impossible. Like, the total Lacanian real is just going to wipe you out, basically. But there is a space where you can work with the other. It's a genuine difference. Like, it requires, basically, ultimately, it requires you becoming comfortable with working through the contradiction of the other. Like, where you, like, if you have space for, the problem is always the problem of the not one. Basically, because you have two people, and they're both, like, in a traditional monogamy, traditional patriarchy. Basically, that was a way to basically reduce the woman to the man. Like, in a traditional patriarchal, traditional home, the wife is best silent. In a traditional patriarchal, right? Like in its most extreme sense.
Most extreme sense.
In its most extreme sense, like the wife is silent. The wife is in the home, and the man has the authority over the home. If you have a modern monogamous relationship where both the man and the woman have a full voice, if you have a modern relationship where both the man and the woman's personal and professional lives matter, well, you're not going to be able to maintain that relationship unless you can work with genuine otherness. Unless you can work with genuine contradiction, which is ongoing and always involving compromises and always involving potential balances of power, which is always presenting you with, in some sense, a little bit of an ethical nightmare.
Yes.
And
So,
psychedelics aren't going to solve that,
Yeah.
but in certain contexts, you could do a psychedelic-mediated psychotherapy in a couple's context where you could potentially handle certain materials that might be difficult to handle otherwise. It's, again, not a cure-all, but it can be a way to cultivate empathy for the other side. It can be a way to cultivate empathy for the other.
Yeah. Yes.
If it's held, usually that, but even then, when it comes to couple therapy, there's always the problem of the third of the mediation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether it's the therapist is ideologically charged as a feminist, or whether it's right and she's gonna always side with the woman or something like that. You always have the problem of it's hard to find a neutral third party to help mediation in a genuine couples conflict, which ultimately, to me, means it's ultimately you, the other, and the abyss.
Yeah.
In the end, that's the neutral third party, really.
Yeah. Yes. I've got a couple more. We may as well do them, and then I'll outline. As I say, this has been a really nice kind of thinking out loud, and as I say, I'll outline then all of the different questions that we brought up here. The next one, I suppose, very quickly is, I think it's important to bear in mind, and I don't see this in the literature or with my people I know here in this world, but to bear in mind that if you're neurotic or if you're psychotic, you're going to have a very different experience of psychedelics.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of people don't understand the structural differences between those two frames of desire and language.
Yeah.
And I kind of go, like, you know, I can understand why neurotics kind of can get a lot out of these experiences of the psychedelics. My thoughts on some of my friends who maybe have psychotic structures and do psychedelics, it's a lot more of a dangerous
I agree.
path.
And that hasn't been, that actually would be an avenue where, because the psychedelic research has only really gone mainstream, and it is going mainstream, but it's only just gone mainstream within the last decade. And there has been basically no attention to psychedelics from a psychoanalytic perspective.
Yes, very little stuff out there. Yeah,
it's a huge problem.
Yeah,
and part of the problem, it does have a little bit to do with a certain type of psychedelic narcissism, where psychedelic researchers don't want to see psychoanalysis as actually a form of knowledge or a form of praxis, which is in some sense superior on the level of mediation.
Yeah.
They would like to see psychedelics as basically an answer, which is like I was telling you about Groff, where he thought psychedelics replaced the need for a psychoanalysis, for example, or somehow beyond Freud and Jung, and allowed us to, for example, reconnect with the shamanistic ways of the prehistorical hunter-gatherer societies, which were in touch with a life wisdom that we've lost, or something like this. Yeah. Right. So that's a field that's fresh to investigate, and the question that I think should outline that investigation is, if you take a look at the major categories in psychoanalysis related to, on the side of the neuroses, you have hysteria and you have obsessional neuroses, and then you have psychosis, and you also have perversion, and there's actually just recently been introduced, probably historically mediated, the category of autism.
Yes, yeah.
So let's say we have 4 categories.
Yeah.
We have the neuroses.
I'm trying to figure out whether I think autism is a force structure. No, I'm very interested.
Who knows?
Very good.
I don't know.
But
there's books on it now.
There's books on it now.
Yeah.
Bruner, you know. So
exactly. So there's books on it now, and people who are interested in the subject, I would encourage. This is a fresh area of investigation
really
that we should be.
Interesting area.
Yeah, we should be in. So let's say we have a tentative quadrant between the neuroses, which were the ground zero of psychoanalysis with Freud, the obsessionals, the hysterics. We usually sexuated between men and women, traditionally. You have the psychotics and the perverts and the autists. And those structures of psyche, famously do not lend themselves to analysis.
Yes. Perverts
because they enjoy their symptom too much. psychotics because they don't even are capable of engaging in transference with the analyst, and autists may be the same. I don't know. I'd have to do research on that topic, but certainly with psychotics and perverts, they don't lend themselves to analysis in the same way. And so we also have to be, and this is where I think the movement of the Slovenian school to philosophical psychoanalysis is, we also have to recognize the limits of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, I think, should be questioned within the political context of neoliberalism. Just the simple fact that you have to pay for an analyst and go through that process, and in the back of your head, you're always like, well, I have to go through sometimes Freud would say, you got to go through an analyst for 4 years, 5 years. So I got to pay for an analyst for 4 years, 5 years. But that's a serious problem, right? So like that, you get the question of, should psychoanalysts be included in our universal health care, right? I would support something like that, I suppose. But
you can get it here, but it's hard to. You can get it as part of National Health Service,
right?
But
a genuine,
not very much, not the genuine 4 days a week.
No. So then consequently what's happened is the degradation of the field of what we call psychotherapy, which is basically practices which do not question the political economic horizon, and which are basically serving instruments and utilitarian aims of capitalism, which basically is a fancy way to say how therapy becomes how quickly can we get you back to work. Right? Like, if you've got some sort of psychological issue which is preventing you from being a functioning cog in the machinery, right? How quickly can we get you back to work?
That's basically mental health. For me, the term mental health is primarily...
How can we get you back to work?
How can we integrate you better into your
neoliberal
environment? Yes, exactly. So
your environment. How can we reintegrate you back into the utopia that is neoliberal capital?
Yes. Whereas analysis at its best is enjoy the fact that you're not part of the world. enjoy your disconnection. Symptom. Enjoy your symptom.
Right. And enjoying your symptom is obviously a slogan that the Slovenian school developed, but if you think about enjoying your symptom, I think about enjoying my symptom. It's notoriously unproductive on terms of capital, right? Enjoying your symptom is not a productive. It's disruptive.
Yes.
And it doesn't fit.
Yes.
Right. So we have basically, and so this brings us back to the themes of pyrotheology, is like a society, and also Todd McGowan's work, where he has the universalization of non-belonging. A society of non-fitters. A society, and that's basically a community of lack, or a community is basically reconciliation with the fact that there is no place to, as it were, fit. The subject does not fit. The subject is not a neatly categorizable thing.
Yes, absolutely. So I think with that, I pretty much kind of said like my initial kind of questions and thoughts, which were, one, the way that psychedelics have traditionally been connected to a certain form of metaphysics and a certain mystical experience of the unreflectively. Yes, exactly. But what interests me is the possibility, which we're talking about and you're bringing up, which is psychedelics that actually bring you into a connection not with the WHOLE but with the HOLE.
Potentially. So let's bring it back to the four categories we're working with: recreational, therapeutic, mystical, and metaphysical. Is that what's useful with these categories is like understanding the set and setting and understanding the limitations of each, and also understanding the potentialities of each, so that we don't use one as like the solution, basically. So recreational is basically, recreational, we're not talking about anything special. We're just talking about, the same way that you might go for a drink with your buddies on a Friday night.
Go for a holiday. You
can do that. Well, I mean, whatever. But it's not, it's just what it is. Recreational use of like you use any other substance.
Yes.
Therapeutic is basically, it's going to not numb you. It's going to open you up to affects, which could be disturbing, which could be great.
Yes.
But it's going to open you up to affects, and then it blows you open to affects, and then you're left with more of yourself. And that's going to cause problems that's going to confront you with non-belonging, because you're like, I've got all these emotions and they don't fit anywhere. And it'll confront you to the problems of the other.
Yeah. Yes.
Because like, I have big feels, right? So like okay, well, I have big feels too. Yeah. So but there's this problem of the other that emerges with these. There's no really place for these big. There's too much of the subject. And we need to think through the therapeutic dimension of genuine talk therapy. Like,
yes, that's exactly, and that's what I've seen missing in some of the people I know in that world is you can have an amazing experience by saying do an MDMA with somebody who's there trip sitting, and you feel like suddenly you're back in oneness with your partner and you feel amazing for a few days. Of course you do, because you're on MDMA, right? But it's what you kind of potentially need in the aftermath of that is then someone who's an analyst who can then you can do transference with, you can do projection, you can have the other. So it's not a narcissistic mirrored experience. But yeah, you've opened up that idea to me that it can potentially have a use alongside talk therapy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's usually being done right now, and I think it probably is safest to be done and makes most sense to me to be done in combination with talk therapy and microdosing. Because with microdosing, you're not in a non-dual state, you're just more open.
Yeah.
You're more in touch with certain sensitivities, certain affects. The mystical is basically, I think the mystical does have a place. I mean, I think the mystical, if we had a place in our society for the mystical, in the sense that instead of on every street corner we have a not to demonize liquor, but if instead of on every corner we have a liquor store, we have places in our society for ceremonial contact with the mystical. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that could be an important part of a healthy society.
I know we'd have to think it through because I could see, I can see a Brave New World version of it, but I can also see a productive version. The problem is, of course, it's like cannabis in America. Is that now there are in every corner of these shops, and it's woven into the consumerist kind of economic system.
That's the thing, and that's ultimately, like here, like we're having a conversation about a specific topic, but of course, I mean. The biggest horizon is like, well, Zizek said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? And ultimately, all of these things, no matter what we're talking about, they are sucked up into capitalist machinery. So like you've got, even cannabis or mushrooms, and we've got companies who are now moving in and fighting for territory, and actually that's the metaphysical battle within the capitalist horizon, and then is quite vicious, right? Like, and people are fighting for market share.
And this this is potentially very quickly going to be a multi-billion-dollar industry.
It's a huge business.
So it's and every time that money is involved, including in medicine and therapy or whatever, big questions have to be asked, and this is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
I think ultimately psychedelics is a symptom, but it can be, but it also has there's also a positive dimension to the symptom, and also enjoy your symptom.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So there is that contradiction which we need to think through, and that's why we're basically, I think that what we're trying to think is on the level of philosophy, because if you're on the level of philosophy, basically what you're trying to do is think the material of contradiction.
Yes.
And so if we're thinking the material of contradiction, we have to say, okay, psychedelics are having a moment. How can we actually think through how best to navigate this moment? There should be a space for enjoyment of symptoms, but at the same time, we should have a space for real philosophical analysis of symptomology of society.
And that's why we're having this conversation, because I think it's got to the point where I think having this conversation is important precisely because of how big this is, and it needs to be thought through. And something you said to me earlier, because we're on the metaphysics really, is that you said, which is something that I've noticed, but you said like a lot of the people in the 60s, the smart people who were doing this, for whatever reason, they weren't writing. They were speaking, you said, like kind of equivalent to Burning Man.
Yeah.
But in terms of like good literature and good thinking, there's
virtually nothing.
Yeah.
It's impoverished, and so that brings us to the problem of this distinction, which is so important in the science of logic, between immediacy and mediation, and basically the difference there is between the immediacy of your ego just being obliterated and the mediation of negativities in the world, and that's but we have to, like, that's again bringing it to thinking the material of contradiction, is that we have to think our moment, and we have to continue to not just have podcasts but do genuine research. Build genuine research programs, and we have to continue to write books, and we have to continue to build an intellectual, philosophical environment that is capable of sense-making the complexity of this reality.
And at the moment, it seems like it's dominated by neuroscientists. Like that's the only people who seem to be, writing.
Well, they get the most funding.
They most get the most funding, and there's a place for that stuff. But there's a lot of it's not as rigorous intellectually sometimes, although it's
that space of presuppositions is basically where the philosopher will operate and question and be a questioner. So, like, for example, I just read a study about a philosophy of neuroscience where they're questioning the connectivist paradigm within neuroscience. So, like, this idea that we could do the connectome and we could study all the connections in the brain, and that we could map all the connections in the brain. But this new philosophical reflection on that paradigm was basically pointing towards the fact that it's actually not just the connections in the brain that are important, but actually the shape or the form of the brain. And it's not so much the connections of the brain, that there are other organisms that have more connection. But just saying, like, this is a space of presuppositions, a space of questioning presuppositions, and we need philosophy to do that, right? So and we should also, for example, the presupposition of neuronal correlates, that we can correlate your subjective experience with a certain connective pattern in the brain. This is a space where we can have philosophers questioning these presuppositions, and what does that really mean? And so, for example, and this has relevance to the psychedelic space I'm very sympathetic to, where, for example, you put me an MRI machine on my head while I'm on ayahuasca, and I have some experience of Jesus, and then you say that's connected to a certain neuronal pattern. It's like, well, there's still the phenomenology of that experience.
Yes. Yeah.
That phenomenology of that experience is you showing me that there's a certain connection in my brain that's connected with that phenomenology. It means nothing to me, right? So these types of things is where philosophy is very operative. And then beyond the phenomenology, metaphysics is not really phenomenology. Metaphysics is logic. And that's fundamental, because basically the logical categories we use to organize our world is basically, when we're talking about politics, we're talking about, again, bringing it back to in the 1960s, psychedelics was a mystical generative force that led to new metaphysical battles related to feminism, civil rights, and all these other things, and the way in which we categorized our world. So the question I have is, really, what is the relationship in the 21st century between psychedelics and a new metaphysics? Because it seems to me, on the level of metaphysical battles, a lot of people are rehashing categories from the 20th century, whether it's communism, fascism, whether it's like liberal democracy. We have a crisis of categories.
Yeah. Well, we should, I'm thinking of the time, so I want to kind of just summarize then where we've come. We talked about the whole, the disruptive, and I think that's, for me, one of the most important areas, and that's good we spent time on that. I would like to have talked about my own experience within the charismatic tradition, which has very similar experiences to the experiences on DMT and MDMA, and this idea of a subtractive mystical experience. So maybe that'll be a conversation for another time. Or do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I can say something very quickly about it, because I do think it's important to talk, and it's important that I think we get this right. So, for example, the whole with the WHOLE is basically usually some sort of substantial identification where I feel full.
Yeah.
Now, in the Hegelian tradition, so Hegelian philosophy, if you look right from the start of the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit, what Hegel's basically saying is that we're not just dealing with a human being and a human society which has lost connection to the whole with the WHOLE, but they've become reflective of the whole, the HOLE, that there's something missing, that there's a nothing, there's a lack, there's something gaping in being. Yeah. And he says the common people will demand philosophers to somehow reconnect them to the whole, the WHOLE, but he said he denies this path.
Yes.
right? And he says, no, you've got to go into the whole.
Yes.
And going in, and what's at stake in going into the whole, very simply, is differentiation, conceptual differentiation. And if you think about the history of the modern world, what is it about? It's mostly about creating the political spaces for genuine individuation. And now that's politically most seen in like rights movements. You have women's rights movements, you have gay rights movements, you have civil rights movements, you have animal rights movements. So it's all about basically creating more rights, more political spaces, more freedom for individuation. And a lot of the philosophy that's come from the post-Hegelian world, like I'm thinking about Deleuze as a metaphysician, he's emphasizing individuation. He's emphasizing difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So when we think about difference, when we think about individuation, I mean, ultimately we have to think about how difficult it is to build genuine communities, genuine social spaces, inclusive of individuation. We can't go back to the traditional models of wholeness.
Yeah.
The traditional models of wholeness are trying to eradicate differentiation. They're trying to create homogenization. They're trying to create undifferentiation. And this is really, to me, one of the things where there's many different thinkers from Lacan to Girard to Deleuze, who would be bringing our attention to the problems of totalitarian political movements which are trying to create undifferentiation.
Yes. Very good, very good. Well, so we've covered that. We brought up, just bringing up kind of what we covered, the question of, the unconscious and psychedelics, and I kind of wanted to bring that up. Question of psychedelics as connecting us with the world or disconnecting us from the world. We talked about that. The questions around what were the other concerns? Well, thing that we only touched on, but the difference between different structures and doing psychedelics, and how beneficial is it, for example, for someone who's got a psychotic structure or autistic structure.
These are open questions.
So so I'm always going to use the questions we'll explore.
But generally speaking, psychedelics tend to be most conducive to the neurotic structure, it seems.
Yes.
And potentially more dangerous for the psychotic person in the sense of further distancing themselves from the world, because the problem with the psychotic is that they're precisely out of the world.
Yes, I know that's my intuition as well. Yeah, that's what we're.
Whereas with the neurotic, you say you have some neurotic obsessional fixation, and the psychedelic state might give you some distance from that and loosen it up a bit, and maybe you think about it more. Maybe you play with it differently.
Yes, exactly. Well, listen, man, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for this conversation. I've got a feeling people want to kind of like go deeper into these conversations, and you have an interview you did with Peter. What was his name?
Peter Shosted Hughes.
Always get his name. But that we look at this and explore this, so check that out. But apart from that, man, thanks so much for being part of Wake yesterday and being part of this Paro seminar today.
It's been a pleasure, and if anyone wants to find out more of my work, philosophyportal.online.
Fantastic. Thank you. Bye, everybody.